In this week's episode, I'm doing another solo episode, and I'll be talking about roller derby fighting for inclusion, turning city noise into comfort, breaking the funding bottleneck for diverse founders, and more. Hey there, my name is Bernadette Smith, and I'm a keynote speaker and writer. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome to 5 Things in 15 Minutes, my weekly show where I bring good vibes to DEI. That is good vibes to diversity, equity, and inclusion with a little dash of corporate social responsibility. What I found is there are lots of news stories about what's going wrong in the world and lots of negative data. But there are also a lot of things going right. That's what I like to focus on. I search for stories that we can be inspired by and learn from. My hope is to inspire you to experiment with some of these actions and policies to help you build a more inclusive world. Let's get started. Okay. All right, folks. So listen, I understand that we are in this kind of crazy place in our world right now where there's a lot of, it is hard to find the good vibes. Let's just put it that way. It is hard to find these stories right now. And so, sometimes it can be hard to find reasons for hope and reasons for optimism when it just seems like all of the progress or so much of the progress that we've worked on seems to be falling apart or going backwards. At least that's how it seems on the surface, right? Especially because of all of the clickbait headlines, all of the deluge of executive orders. There's just so much negativity coming at us all at once. And so I think that it's really important to remember that there are really good things happening. And one of the things that made me excited last week, because I own a small consulting firm, I wrote this book, Inclusive 360, and I created an app called Inclusive 360. And the app goes along with my book. And the idea is that it's a series of questions divided into 16 different functional areas within an organization. So 16 different functions. So these could be various functions in HR. I think maybe there might be 6 functions that are related to HR, but also functions like product development, marketing, events, and community relations, procurement. So lots of other functions as well. And the idea behind my book and the idea behind the app is to identify and share opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion within all of those functions, not just within the HR function, which is where DEI often lives within an organization. And so the idea is that if all of the functions are working simultaneously towards becoming Inclusive 360, then we can take some of the pressure off of HR, focus more on the business imperative, give more people some skin in the game, some stake here, and increase the amount of stakeholders and increase the stickiness of DEI to basically make DEI the default. So that was the vision. That is still the vision. That is still the path that we're on. And I just got validation of that last week. So I had a sales call with a fintech company that is really interested in this product because they've sort of gotten to this place within their own organization where they've raised awareness within employees, awareness of their own unconscious bias, awareness of how to be an ally. They've raised awareness of what it means to be an inclusive leader. So they've done a lot of this type of work already. And so what they're ready to do now is sort of move into the next phase of DEI for their organization. This is an organization with thousands of employees, by the way. And that for them means that they're looking to embed DEI into all of their functions, into each of their different roles, right? And so the idea is that this company is ready to become Inclusive 360. Let me just pull up some of those different functions. So there's research and development and product marketing, recruitment, comp and benefits, talent development, learning, organization development, internal communications, etc., sales and customer service, and plant. It goes on and on. And so the idea is that, this is a company that's ready to look at ways to embed inclusion into these functions. And because of that, I have hope. So that's where this story is coming back to, because this company, and many more like it, by the way, many more like it, even if they're doing it quietly, even if they're not making the headlines, many organizations are looking to make DEI sticky. In this case, they're looking to use our tool to identify the gaps of equity and inclusion and then close the gaps by engaging employees across all functions. And that is how we make DEI the default. When equity and inclusion are just sort of the way things are done, it's a hell of a lot harder to take them away. So I tell you all of this because, I am personally affected by anti-DEI backlash. I know it's exhausting, but I want to remind you that the work is still happening. There are great organizations that are still moving forward. Leaders are stepping up. We are not stopping. So listen, all of us have a responsibility to help build a more inclusive world. And that's how I close each of my newsletters this week. Thank you for helping build a more inclusive world. All of us have a responsibility for that. So my message is to keep going. We are not turning back. We can all help our organizations, help our lives become inclusive 360. All right, well, let's move into this week's Good Vibes. All right, the first story this week comes from the WFTDA, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association has reaffirmed its commitment to inclusivity by clarifying its gender statement. So there have been some policy shifts here in the U.S. which have made it more difficult for women, trans women in particular, to participate in women's sports, despite there's being no sort of medical validity that they are actually stronger or more advanced in any way. So this is a big statement by the Flat Track Derby Association. So they have said that it ensures all people of marginalized gender. So they're very explicit. So that's women, including trans, cis, intersex, and gender expansive women, non-binary, two-spirit, and intersex individuals. They're all welcome in all roles. Gender identity is private, and we will not impose any standards of presentation. So what I love about this is how explicit it is. There's really no room for interpretation, right? I mean, it's so inclusive by being so explicit, and even going so far as to say we're not imposing any standards of presentation. So that's really significant. I think there's some great wording here that other organizations should look to as they clarify their own policies of what it means to be inclusive of all women. So love this. All right, the second story this week is coming from New York City, where a New York City public school had some students with autism who were struggling with nearby highway noise. So the designers installed soundscape pods. So these are movable bumblebee-shaped shelters that let kids choose calming sounds like birds or rain instead of blaring traffic. Meanwhile, the Neurodiverse City Project is allowing neurodivergent participants to have influence in the city design. Those of you who are listening, go check out the video on LinkedIn and YouTube. They have Neurodiverse City Project has this initiative where they're giving folks disposable cameras with frames. So they take a picture using the disposable camera and this frame of things that make them happy or joyful or anxious or whatever as they are moving through the city. And so it's a way for folks, it's a way for this project to collect data on how folks who are neurodivergent are experiencing the city, what's causing them the greatest challenges, how can the city itself figure out how to make the city more safe, stressful, or soothing for these folks. So that's how they're using the data. I love what's happening in New York. The feedback so far has inspired soft public seating, nature-inspired murals, and noise buffering elements. So it's working. The feedback is working. I love that this is a really creative way in one of the world's biggest cities to include more neurodivergent folks. All right, the third story this week comes from Tech Resources, which has inclusion centers at their Chilean mine sites. Okay, so these inclusion centers provide professional counseling, gender-based violence prevention training, and wellness support in an industry notorious for male dominance and isolation. Now, as a result of these inclusion centers, there's been a jump in women mine workers from 16% to 27% in just 2 years, and over 7,000 employees and community members have been trained on sexual harassment prevention, diversity, and mental health. I love that they have seen such a huge increase in women miners. And I think this is a great example of how structural support, which is what it means to be Inclusive 360, like structural change, structural support, has made, in this case, the industry, this workplace, safer, more equitable, and ultimately more resilient. And whether we're talking about physical safety, which could be the case in these mines, or psychological safety, it is incredibly important to make sure that we're thinking about how safety plays a role at work. And, you know, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think safety is one of the top. I think it's the second most important need to folks. I will have to make sure we double check that, but I'm pretty sure it is. I think let's just say, safety is, yes, the second most important need. All right, so the fourth story this week comes from Stacey Brown Philpott, former TaskRabbit CEO, who just closed a $172 million fund with major backers like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. And the goal of this fund is to invest in underrepresented founders. So Cherry Rock Capital has really focused on this form of economic oppression. So how underrepresented founders, they might get some funding during seed rounds, which is lower than cis white founders in general. But in subsequent rounds, there's a particular disparity. So women, Black, and brown founders face even greater barriers in subsequent rounds, with less than 2% of venture capital dollars historically going to Black entrepreneurs. So this fund is really designed to close that gap, at least somewhat. It's going to take a lot to close that gap. There are other funds who are working on it, but, you know, this is a case of now more than ever, we need this kind of investment to help these folks thrive and close the racial and gender wealth gaps. And the last story this week comes from The Daily Show, a little bit of joy, if you like some satire. How to un-DEI your office. They made a little a mock HR training video in which they guide workers through unlearning some of the lessons of the past 4 years. So how do you unlearn microaggressions, wrongful firings, and mediocre white men failing upward? We'll watch this video and find out. So it's very funny. I mean, DEI isn't just dismantling DEI is not taking away bias. It's just it's going to be there, and we need to keep having these conversations. And I love how comedy is a powerful tool against injustice, and comedy has definitely been a good outlet for me lately. By the way, shout out to my son, Patrick, for showing me this video. He is a Daily Show fan, so he's the one that showed me this video. Proud mom. All right, so let's move into this week's Good Vibes to Go. So speaking of comedy, my first good vibe to go is to check out The Lonely Flowers stand-up special by Roy Wood Jr. on Hulu. It's really funny. I mean, I get a lot of joy out of stand-up, especially stand-up that brings me different perspectives from my own lived experiences. And I think that there's just such a need for that now. I think we need to keep understanding how other people are experiencing the world. And there is an epidemic of loneliness that Roy talks about in this show. So definitely check out that special on Hulu if you're looking for some laughs. And the second good vibe to go is it is Ramadan coming up on Friday. So make sure you have some tips to be inclusive of folks you might know, Muslim folks who might be celebrating Ramadan. Here are a few tips for those who are watching. It's beginning on March 1st, ending on March 29th. And I'll make sure we get some tips in the show notes for you as well. So you can be sure to make sure you are friendly and kind and respectful and inclusive of your Muslim friends and colleagues. All right, I'm going to put up a little quote this week as well. We need to keep this good energy up. And Coca-Cola is a company that last week really, again, companies are doubling down. They're saying we are here for DEI. And so Coca-Cola made a statement. If we are unable to attract or retain specialized talent or top talent with diverse perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds that reflect the broad range of consumers and markets we serve around the world, our business could be negatively affected. So Coca-Cola is saying we are in for DEI. We understand the business case. The business case is alive and well, folks. So please keep making the business case if you think that is going to be what influences folks. It matters. It really matters. So we need to make sure we understand how to talk about this stuff. So thank you, Coca-Cola, for giving a great soundbite. And thank you all for joining 5 Things in 15 Minutes. If you don't already get the 5 Things newsletter, you can subscribe at 5thingsdei.com. See you next week. Thank you for listening to 5 Things in 15 Minutes. I hope you found yourself inspired by at least one of this week's stories. If you did, would you mind sharing it with a colleague and leaving us a review on your favorite podcasting platform? And if you don't already get my 5 Things newsletter, join at 5thingsdei.com. I'm Bernadette Smith, and I'll see you next week right here for 5 Things in 15 Minutes, bringing good vibes to DEI.